What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Manchester City versus RB Leipzig in the Champions League and how the tactics involved led to such a crazy scoreline among the two teams. Manchester City ended up winning the match 6-3 after 90 minutes. And before we get into that, check out my books. They're online and they're on Amazon. There's links in the description below. Also, check out Keyframe. It's how I make this video, and it's an affordable solution for anyone who wants to make content or wants to involve more video in their coaching. So let's get into the video. Now, Manchester City built from the back in their typical formation with their two central defenders being split by their goalkeeper. Then we had Fernandinho come on for Rodri in the second half, so we see Fernandinho here, and Zinchenko and Cancelo were the wide fullbacks to start the game. The RB Leipzig team lined up in a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-2-2 with advanced wide midfielders that joined the first line in their press. And their pressing strategy was a pretty typical pressing strategy, as one forward would go and press, and then the other would drop and invert to block the holding midfielder. And then as the ball was circulated, the player pressing would then drop to the holding midfielder, and then the other forward would go and press the central defender when the ball was circulated. Manchester City had a few different variations once they reached the midfield third, and the first of which that we'll talk about is when the fullbacks used the full width of the field and used the full width of the field on the strong side. And what this did is it created space for the central defender to then attract pressure from the midfield and from the first line of pressure, as well as opening up space for dropping midfielders in the half space, and it created our four-man rondo structure and created a 4v3 numerical superiority on one side of the field. So then the pressing strategy of RB Leipzig in their mid-block now, we see their clear shape of a 4-2-2-2. And in this structure against Manchester City, they relied heavily on positional superiority, using the cover shadow to block the holding midfielder, and then dual access to their two central midfielders to then try and block passes if the cover shadow failed, to then block access into more advanced positions. So we see the fullback is wide here. Ake advances the ball with the holding midfielder to his right, and they create a rondo situation in a four-man structure, which then is quickly pressed by the two forwards, blocking off the holding mid and cutting off circulation to the weak side, to then force Manchester City to play in a confined area and trying to limit their amount of circulation with their two forwards pressing, using their cover shadow to then force them into pressure. And this is when RB Leipzig become very dangerous. When they have numbers around the ball, circulation looks isolated, and the mutual help space is cut off through cover shadows and positional superiority, because then from here their effective transition would be made up of four players, their two inverted wide midfielders, putting them in a more central and dangerous position, and their two forwards in the central corridor. So they'd have a lot of players in central areas to then springboard their attack going forward in transition. Manchester City, varying their use of their fullbacks, had Zinchenko and Cancelo, which meant that they could both play these inverted roles, and especially Zinchenko coming in the left-hand side now. He definitely inverted more than Manchester City have to start the year, and this gave them unique opportunities to use the wide area or break directly through the half spaces. So when the ball was circulated against the RB Leipzig players, as we'll line up here, so we have our 4-4-2 mapped out, then we see Zinchenko, the inverted fullback, alongside Rodri, who's now the free player in the cover shadow of the central forward for RB Leipzig. So by positioning himself very narrow in an inverted position, it then frees up the opportunity to release Grealish right away and look to attack the wide fullback in a 2-versus-1 situation after Ake advances the ball via dribbling and finds the vacant free man in the wide area because of the over-narrowing the inverting of Zinchenko has on the wide midfielder. Again, another situation with Zinchenko inverting now, And one of the biggest things that you can take advantage of with a team like RB Leipzig using their cover shadows so heavily in their defensive phase is the opportunity to break them via blindside movements and creating positional superiority in behind in their blindside to then manipulate your offensive structure to create these solid passing lanes in between defenders and eliminate their first line of press with one pass. Now with RB Leipzig in possession, their goalkeeper too split their two central defenders, and in the first phase of build-up they went with a double pivot, matching up alongside each other, which would then, we would often see them favoring the half space, and one of them would typically drop deeper into the first line of pressure. Manchester City lined up in a 4-3-3 out of possession, and they looked very susceptible when the ball went into wide areas, which we'll talk about in 1 second. But with De Bruyne coming back into the team, he played more as the number 10. So when De Bruyne would jump into the first line of pressure and press a holding midfielder or use his cover shadow to then extend his press into the first line of RB Leipzig's build-up, their shape would shift to a 4-2. Their shape would shift into a 4-2-4. So now we see the fullbacks giving the width for RB Leipzig with their two central defenders on the ball, and RB Leipzig had a very direct approach, very fast build-up, and very vertical, which caused them to not play out of the back as much as we would typically see from certain teams. But then we also see De Bruyne here jumping to press the holding midfielder and then extend his press into the first line of build-up. So this is where we start to see Manchester City's 4-2-4 pressing system. Now RB Leipzig central midfielder drops into the first line of build-up, making them now build with a single pivot, which worked well for them against this Manchester City team because with the front three, it created natural passing angles into their holding midfielder and gave them good diagonal access to this player. We also see the overload between the narrow wide midfielders and one of the forwards dropping deeper while the other creates height within the structure, giving them a free man further forward in the 10 position. So this is the start of why the wide areas were so dangerous against Manchester City, because when the ball would enter wide positions, in the cover shadow of the Manchester City midfielders would be the number 10 or a narrow wide midfielder of RB Leipzig to collect possession after the ball was circulated into a wide area and go. But with the Manchester City shape, their 4-3-3 or 4-2-4 often allowed their opponents to play into the wide area, as we didn't see Manchester City press out to in with their wingers using their cover shadows as much. Now we can see the whole RB Leipzig build-up shape when the ball would go into the wide area. We'd have our back four, our two holding midfielders, joined by a number 10 or our second striker dropping deeper, and now our narrow wide midfielders positioning themselves in the half space. And this forced Manchester City to either make decisions on whether to play an offsides trap or play very conservative and play more narrow in their back four and concede space in the wide area. So as we see here, the Manchester City shape looks a 4-2-4 with De Bruyne just positioning himself between the first line and second line of pressure, now looking to press the central defender, but with the RB Leipzig shape and build-up tendency to go very direct to their narrow players looking to get in behind. If De Bruyne were to commit further forward, it would actually work against Manchester City and not give them as much cover in behind. And here's a situation now we're just going to look at really quick with the ball that's going to enter the wide area, and then we'll see our number 10 collect the ball from the wide area in behind the midfielders of Manchester City, and we'll start to see now why we talk about pinning players and pinning defenders and why it's so important that when a defender is pinned, they accept the fact that they're pinned and they don't try and jump to then win the ball unless they're absolutely certain. So here, Nathaniel Ake sees the ball from the wide area coming, so he jumps into the center to then pick up the number 10 receiving the ball. But what this happens is it then creates players in behind him around the ball with direct lanes to goal, while he's stuck in no man's land, and the back line is keeping them on side. So this is why it's so important. If Ake would stay deeper, then it would be much harder for the number 10 to find these passes. But when Ake commits himself, then all the space in the world is there to be accessed in behind with Ake out of position. And then finally, we're going to look up the last RB Leipzig shape with their 5-man midfield with 3 players in advanced positions, a double pivot, and their fullbacks creating the width. And this 5-man midfield is made up through their double pivot and their number 10 dropping deeper, and his space is created by the number 9 stretching Manchester City's back line, playing off their shoulder. And by having so many players positioned in these positions with the fullbacks using the full width, it creates diagonal passing options in behind to then look for inverted runners looking to get in behind and go very direct. And that's going to wrap up today's analysis. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.